So good morning, and thank you for joining us after a holiday weekend. I'm Robbie Weber with SSTI, and despite what the webinar box tells you, I'm not Bill Holloway. I'm simply using his logon to this webinar. The topic of the webinar today is making the case for system preservation. System preservation is a topic that many state and local DOTs are facing. We know infrastructure is aging and in need of some tender loving care, but fixing things just aren't as sexy as opening a new highway or bridge. We've probably all faced that. The Iowa DOT was struggling with how to argue that additional funding, in this case a gas tax increase, was needed to fund critical maintenance and repairs. They worked with SSTI and Spitfire Strategies, which is a strategic communication firm that works exclusively with nonprofits and foundations. They worked with SSTI and Spitfire to come up with a messaging plan to make the case and to take it to the public. So today we're going to hear from Beth Kanter of Spitfire Strategies, and then later from Stu Anderson and Paul Trombino of the Iowa DOT. And we're going to find out what steps they took to craft the messages and how they were used. I hope this will be helpful to others that are facing the same issues. You'll see on your screen there is a little box where you can type in questions. If you have questions during the presentation, just go ahead and type them in there, and we will get to the questions at the end of the webinar. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So let me just do the introductions. We have Paul Trombino III. He is the director of the Iowa DOT. He's been the director since the summer of 2011. Prior to that, he was right here in Wisconsin working for the Department of Transportation here for 17 years. At WisDOT, he held several positions, last serving as the director of the Bureau of Transit, Local Roads, Rails, and Harbors, and previously as the Regional Operations Director of the Division of Transportation System Development, Director of the Statewide Bureau of Structures, and Manager of Highway Bid Letting. Before coming to WisDOT, Trombino spent 4 years in the finance and banking industry in Chicago and Washington, D.C. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a Bachelor of Science degree in Economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we are located. Joining him also is Stuart Anderson, who is currently the Director of Planning, Programming, and Modal Division at the Iowa DOT. The division is responsible for long-range multimodal transportation planning and programming and the administration of multimodal funding programs. He has a BS in Civil Engineering from Iowa State University. And finally, Beth Kanter is Vice President at Spitfire Strategies. She brings extensive experience in strategic communication and public affairs counsel to nonprofit organizations, government agencies, political campaigns, and large corporations. She has a very long and impressive resume, which I'm not going to list, but she's been working with Smart Growth America to craft some messaging on economic value of sustainable development. And work with some elected officials on that. If I listed all of Beth's different jobs and resume, we wouldn't have time for the webinar, so I'm just going to say that she's worked with a number of organizations in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and also several political campaigns. And I am going to turn over the webinar to Beth, who here are who is going to take it from here, and it's going to take just a minute to transfer the control to Beth. So just give us a minute here, and then she can go ahead and take it away. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks, Robbie. And I believe that I now have control here.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. what I do with that control is a different question. First of all, I wanted to just thank SSTI really for the opportunity to work with the Iowa Department of Transportation to help them develop a messaging framework that would really get to their key audience targets, the state legislature, the governor, to help them figure out the best way to communicate that repair and maintenance message and the real critical need to increase revenue to accomplish that, as it's something that Iowa is dealing with, and we know that so many other state agencies are facing as well. So one of the first things that we did to help craft those messages was a series of background research activities to really inform that strategy around increasing revenue for Iowa's transportation needs. And we did three things primarily. We conducted a media scan, we reviewed materials, and we also were able to look at both national and statewide polling to help inform some of that messaging. So let me just give you a very top-line overview of what we found. When we looked at what was reported in the press, we reviewed media coverage over the 12-month period prior, and what we found were, I think, 4 key points. One, that the problem was more visible than the solution. People seem to really understand that the roads and bridges are in bad shape, but they weren't connecting that to how that could be improved. Like, they were not understanding the need for increased revenue and how that impacted the ability for the state to actually repair and maintain its infrastructure. What also came out was that if the roads aren't maintained, businesses lose money. A pretty important point here that played a big role in terms of how industries viewed this issue. In addition to the economic concerns about the poor state of roads and bridges, there's some serious safety risks that people were concerned about and the media was reporting on. And then finally, that the state does need more revenue to maintain its roads because the gas tax does not provide enough money and construction costs continue to rise because of inflation. We then took a look at a range of materials that primarily were from minutes and written testimony from public input hearings that you'll hear more about from Stu and Director Trombino. We also did look at materials that they put together for the media as well as some brochures. And what we found here is that the majority of Iowans really do understand the need to prioritize road and bridge maintenance over other infrastructure investments. They get that there is a strong need and a real consensus around the fact that Iowa's road network is not acceptable and requires additional funding. And what was interesting was that the majority of people who attended these meetings really do support a gas tax to fund this maintenance work. And that overall, while there was a dual message around both the economy and public safety, it was really the economy that's driving people's desire to actually support a gas tax increase. There is, however, limited discussion of rail or other alternative transportation modes. So that was some of the top-line findings from the materials that we reviewed. And then finally, we did also have an opportunity to I was able to attend one of the public meetings as well as listen on the phone, and as I mentioned, we were able to review minutes and written testimony. And again, the two findings that really bolstered everything else that we heard is that people are concerned about the economic impact, particularly engineers, agricultural industry, trucking industry, as well as public safety. You know, particularly first responders and principals. And, you know, what was interesting, some of the things that we were hearing at these meetings, you know, engineers were talking about how much money was wasted patching 40-year-old roads instead of replacing them, and that, you know, Iowa really is on the verge of structural decay, and how much that these poor roadways really threaten the agricultural and trucking industries. You know, we heard from people about how their profits are really closely linked to reliable roadways and how much their earnings trickle down to the rest of the state. Farmers spoke very passionately about the challenges that they're facing getting their goods to the market as more roads and bridges are off limits because they can't handle the heavier loads. And farming and agricultural related industries, it's so important to Iowa because more than a quarter of the state's overall economic input and it comes from those industries and employs 1 out of every 6 Iowans. And that was really coupled with what we were hearing from these first responders. We heard from firefighters who talked about having to drive miles out of their way to reach an accident scene because bridges are closed or have weight restrictions. Principals talked about buses having to travel extra miles to get kids to school for the same reason. And one of the most compelling things that I heard was from a superintendent who talked about the number of schools who were named after students who had died on Iowa's poor roads because of poor conditions. So the other thing that we were able to spend some time with to help inform our messaging was national polling that was conducted on behalf of Smart Growth America back in November of 2010. And they were really trying to dig deep into what was driving people to support a repair and maintenance agenda. And I think that what's really interesting here is that people understand that in these tight economic conditions that states and the federal government is facing, that maintaining and repairing roads, highways, freeways, and bridges, that's got to be the top priority, much more so than any sort of capacity or new projects. I just think that the comparison here is quite striking. Some other things that came out of this poll, that regardless of party, it doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, Independent, the majority of voters agree with some compelling arguments for repair and maintenance. And let me just take a moment to read some of this. And this was very helpful in some of the language that we use to help craft those messages. That our government has an obligation to the people in this state to create jobs and implement policies to strengthen the economy, protect the environment, ensure opportunity for all. On transportation, we don't need to build more. We need to fix what we have and give citizens low-cost choices that protect the environment and the economy at the same time. And that, we're looking at 78% of Democrats, 60% of Republicans. So amongst all voters, we've got 71% people who are saying that this closely reflects their views, which is pretty compelling. And the final piece that I want to share from this national poll that I also thought was incredibly important is that, again, regardless of party, most people agree that now is the time to invest in transportation. This is despite the fact that states are facing budget shortfalls. People recognize that states should be investing in transportation because if it's done right, these investments are going to create jobs and attract new businesses. And again, 68% of all voters say that this reflects their view. In addition to this national polling, Iowa, there was some statewide polling that was also very helpful that helped demonstrate where public sentiment was and then also helped from a messaging perspective. And just some top-line feedback from that polling. Nearly 30% want the state to spend its money on fixing roads and bridges. And what I thought was interesting here is that compares to, a little bit more than 20% want that money spent on increasing teacher salaries. More than half think that roads and bridges are in mediocre to extremely poor condition. And then from a messaging perspective, we heard things like, that we don't want to be using the term infrastructure, that it's much more compelling to use more colloquial language like the roads and bridges you use every day, along with local examples. And the fact that, the term like user fee polls better than a gas tax. So we took all of that information and we were able to then really hone in on who it was that the Iowa Department of Transportation needed to communicate with. And, we have a very strong feeling here that when evaluating who your audience target is, you can't be thinking about the general public, because when you're talking to the general public, when you're talking to everyone, you're really talking to no one. So you want to think very small, because when you have these broad, diverse messages, they're not going to resonate with folks. So you want to segment until you can't segment anymore. So let me, just give an example of what I'm talking about here. Do I have someone on the line, or I guess everyone's in listen mode, so maybe, Robbie, I can ask you, can you give me 3 adjectives that you would use to describe yourself?
Sure. Bicyclist, urban dweller, and environmentalist.
All right, excellent. So, 3 words to describe me. Let's see. I'm a reader, I'm a mom, and I like to run. If you ask anyone on the phone, they're going to say 3 things about themselves that will describe them. And I don't think that anyone is going to respond that they're the general public. So I believe in a very liberal use of adjectives. So, if you're talking, you don't want to just say, oh, I'm targeting women. How about women between the ages of 40 and 60 who live in the suburbs, who have children and like country music? Then you can really kind of hone in on who you are talking about. And that's really important, because when you are creating your messages, you really want to make sure you know who your audience is, because you want to tap into their values. And that's how Spitfire creates its messages. It's a value-based message system. There are 4 key pieces to what we call the message box. And, why are there only 4? It's our belief that people can really only remember 4 things. And the great thing about this message box is that you can drop in at any point. You can use them individually or all together. So the value message, the top part of the message box, this is where you really connect with your audience and tap into a specific value that your audience has. It reminds people of your common ground, and you're saying something that's really going to get them to agree with you and nod their heads. And what's really important here is that this is what your audience cares about, because not everyone shares the same values. So you need to know what your audience target cares about to create messages that are going to get them to listen to you. Sometimes, you're not going to necessarily know what your audience cares about, and that's where research can come in. Whether it's a public opinion poll like we had the benefit of having, or focus groups, or there's other ways that you can really investigate what's important to them. You really want to keep in mind that sometimes your audience's core concerns won't be obvious, and it may require some work on your part to figure this out. The next part of the message box is what we refer to as the barrier message, or overcoming the barrier. How will you get over their best excuse for not doing what it is that you want them to do? So you've said something in your value message that's got them nodding their heads in agreement, but then they come back at you, yeah, but you want to immediately address this hesitation. So think about what are some of the key points. This is where data and statistics, like used sparingly but effectively, can be very helpful to combat any sort of misconceptions that might be out there. But the key to a successful barrier message is that you never repeat your audience's misconception. Always think about, Richard Nixon, I am not a crook. You don't want to repeat that barrier. Rather, you really want to provide new or unexpected information to overcome the barrier, so that your audience starts buying into what it is that you're saying. Then you have your ask. This is what you want your audience to do. It should be really clear and attainable. The one specific thing. You've got their attention. You want them to do something, even if it's as simple as going to your website. That's why you've really got to understand who your audience is, what they care about, and what they're willing to do. Are you going to ask them to go to your website? Are you going to ask them to pick up the phone and to call a state legislature to support a gas tax? Are you going to ask them to sign a petition? What is it? What's the point in getting their attention if you don't do it to help reach your goals? And then finally is your vision part of your message box. And this should really echo the value message point. It says to people, if you do what I ask you to do, then you're going to get what you want. It gives them a sense of that aspirational thing that they can really hope for. And again, it should reflect the value so that it goes full circle. You know, for example, if your audience really values the economy, you don't want a message that reflects, you know, something that they don't care about, like if they really don't care about safety. So how does this work from a practical perspective? Let me give you an example around issues that we're talking about here. So here we've got our audience is voters, and I would strongly suggest that you would want to segment that even more than just voters themselves, to be as specific as you can. And what do we know that they value? It's this counterbalance of both a strong economy as well as public safety. So what message is going to resonate with them? State transportation should do two things: be safe and reliable for citizens and support our state's economies and jobs. Yeah, that all sounds fine and good, but I've got concerns about that. You know, I don't know. You know, are there really bad roads and bridges? You know, what is it a good return on my investment? You know, is this the best way that the state could be spending money? Yes, in fact it is, and let me tell you why. You know, roads and bridges are crumbling across your state, across Iowa, and at the same time people need more ways to get around, and we can't afford to spend more, but we can be spending better. So what are we going to ask them to do? You know, tell your state leader that you think Iowa should focus its limited transportation resources on repairing and maintaining existing roads and bridges. What will happen because of that? Then citizens will have a safe and reliable transportation system that also fuels the economy. So that's kind of how the message box works there. And let me just, you know, as we open this up to questions later, I'd be happy to address any specific questions about how the message box works. But just very quickly, I want to some key things that we took away both from our research and the conversations that we had with people in Iowa that I think are very transferable to other states. That one, again, that we've got to tie this repair and maintenance agenda to the economic impact that it's going to have. That you know, for Iowa in particular, but I think that this is true in other states as it relates to other industries that are important. You know, the connection between poor roadways, poor bridges, the threats that can have to industry. And that, again, if Iowa or any state really wants to attract new business, they need to have their roads in a state of good repair. Not only are poor roadways inconvenient and unsafe, you know, they really do pose a significant economic impact, and that's the key message that we want to take away here. Particularly farming and agricultural-related industries, they account for more than a quarter of the state's overall economic input, and again, 1 in 6 Iowans are employed by these industries, and you know, farmers can't afford to have their products delayed. What was interesting that came out that we heard is that out-of-state businesses consider infrastructure when deciding when to invest. That's not new. But what I think is really interesting and a great barrier message here to help overcome that barrier is that every $1 billion invested in highways creates or supports more than 44,000 jobs. That's really compelling when you're talking about the need to grow the economy and how transportation can really impact that. So just how do you use these messages? How can they be really infused into the way that agencies are talking about these things? Like Iowa, at community meetings, public input hearings, make sure that you're being consistent about these messages. You can go and talk with your editorial boards in your major cities and towns to make sure they understand why this is important, how the state and local infrastructure, how that really has an impact on the community. Letters to the editor and op-eds by third-party validators can be extremely compelling. And those are just a couple of ways that you can use these messages to get the point across to voters or whoever your audience targets are. And then again, if I can just leave you with one final thought, you know, that voters really do care about repair and maintenance. As Robbie said, you know, ribbon cuttings and new bridges and new roads are really sexy, but voters get it. They get the need that they've got to have bridges and roads in a state of good repair. And again, tying that message to the economic impact that can have is really what's most important. So thank you, and I will now turn it back over to Robbie.
Well, thank you, Beth. That was great, and I think it's something that people can use in other areas for whatever their message is that they want to bring to other people. I'm just going to switch over here. There we go. And I'm going to now turn it over to both Stu Anderson and Paul Trombino from the Iowa DOT. And they're going to tell us how they use some of that messaging in Iowa. And Stu has the mouse and keyboard, so I'm going to let him go.
All right, well, good morning. This is Stu Anderson, and I'll begin the discussion going through the slides here. Let me make sure this works for me.
There we go.
And yeah, there we go. All right. We'll go through these slides relatively quickly because we want to make sure we have time at the end for questions and discussion. Beth did a great job of going through the process they used and helping us assist with a message. And as we go through the slides here, I'll try to highlight some specific areas where that influenced the information we presented to the public and how we proceeded. To begin with, we really had two separate goals in this initiative. The first is, as we've talked about, just increasing funding for roadway infrastructure in the state of Iowa. And that really had a broad audience of not only the public, but legislators, other decision makers. Then the second goal was more related directly to that shift to system preservation. And the audience for that discussion from the DOT perspective really is our Transportation Commission. We have a commission in Iowa that makes all the programming decisions for the state jurisdiction roadways. And Iowa, although we are a pretty rural state, you would think that the emphasis would have always been on investing in the existing system, but actually we've gone through in the 90s where the majority of our funds were going into building 4-lane corridors across the state, which was really viewed as an ability to provide economic opportunity to rural areas of the state. So really we needed to have this discussion of system preservation as well, and it's one that's been ongoing, but we wanted to have some additional emphasis on in this round. The next several bullets on the overview we'll go through. These really are related to the messaging we provided as we had some public discussion this past year. And so again, I'll go through those relatively quickly, but wanted to let you see exactly some examples that we provided in our public input sessions. And then we'll close with where we're at today and perhaps most importantly, what some of the lessons learned, what worked and what didn't work through the process. So the next several slides are slides we directly used as we had public input sessions throughout the state in the summer, as I mentioned. We talk a lot about the funding challenges, and I think in talking about messaging, you'll see this messaging is all about the challenges we face in maintaining the system we have today. And we talked about the perfect storm where we have large and aging roads and bridges with increasing demands, but perhaps more importantly than increasing demands is some changing demands on the system with large wind energy components being hauled on the system, shifts in renewable fuel infrastructure we have here in the state. And then also challenges on the revenue side where revenue isn't growing like it was in the 90s. It's relatively flat now with travel slowing down or even decreasing a couple years, greater increase in fuel efficiency vehicles, and then also the construction cost inflation rate challenges we face. And then not unique to Iowa, but severe weather impacts, whether it's lots of freeze-thaw cycles in winters, heavy snow in the winters, or flooding impacts. Another thing we tried to do with our messaging is provide some graphics that tell a story. And this is just one example that we used in trying to show the revenue challenges with relatively flat revenue, showing receipts in real dollars in blue, but then to get at some of that construction cost inflation impacts on buying power, where we can show from 2003 to 2008 that 67% increase in construction costs in the state of Iowa over that 5-year period, and the impact that had on buying power, where in 2011 we had, or 2010, we were 25% less buying power than we were back in 1997. Now, speaking specifically about the funding challenges, we talked about the funding shortfalls that we face, not only to meet all needs in the system, but we felt it was important, again, getting back to the messaging, talking about those needs that are most critical to grow and support the state's economy. So we focused in on a subset of needs that we defined as most important for the economic vitality of Iowa, and estimated that funding shortfall at $215 million. And then to tell that story to the public, we wanted to give them examples of what happens if that critical funding shortfall isn't met with additional revenue, where we're going to see more bridges that are closed or embargoed with weight restrictions, deteriorating conditions that will impact the movement of goods and people, but then also the increased cost to transportation, both, again, movement of goods and people, that can have economic losses for the state of Iowa. So again, messaging the economic impacts of the infrastructure on the existing system. We also felt it was important to let the public know that, you know, this isn't something that just happened overnight, that we've been working on this for a long time. One of the areas that we continually are challenged with is how to get information to I guess the average citizen that gets interviewed whenever there's a story about the potential for raising fuel taxes or user fees, and they often come back, well, they just need to get more efficient or use the funds better. So we felt it was important to say we hear that loud and clear, and that's something we've been working on for a long time. So we talk about some past efforts to increase efficiency and how they've been successful, both in working in a partnership with local jurisdictions in Iowa, but also through individual actions. So we go through some examples of those past efforts. And then also talk about how, you know, the legislature recognizes this is something that is important and needs to be studied. And actually in Iowa, through one of our earlier study efforts, we recommended, the legislature required that the DOT do a study looking at needs and revenues every 5 years, and actually the timing of that, which really pushed all of this initiative this year, is that we had a study due the end of December of 2011. One of the great things that happened is we had a newly elected governor, Governor Terry Branstad, who actually had been a governor in Iowa back in the 80s and early 90s, and he was reelected. And right when he came into office in January of 2011, he recognized the importance of Iowa's roadway system, and he felt it was important. He knew that the DOT was going to have to do a study, but he felt it was important to have another body that leads the public discussion on this exchange of information about the roadway system. So he created this independent task force called the Governor's Transportation 2020 Citizen Advisory Commission that had citizen appointees and also ex officio legislative members on it. And he tasked them with assisting the DOT in completing its study, primarily by having a really aggressive public outreach effort. So he appointed that group in March, and then in June and July they really began their efforts. And getting back, I guess, to some of the Spitfire messaging efforts, in working with the Citizen Advisory Commission, really felt it was important to look broadly for the stakeholder groups and get their involvement early on, besides or in addition to a broad public input, and not just look at the traditional players and as stakeholders. And you can see that economic link with some groups here. I'll highlight just a couple. The Iowa Bankers Association, that's a group that's not traditionally at the table and talking about road needs, but We have a lot of small town banks across Iowa, and we'd heard from them that they're hearing a lot from bank presidents about the challenges of the road infrastructure system and its impact on their local businesses that they support. The Iowa Chamber Alliance is a group of chambers of commerce in Iowa's larger cities. So we had them at the table as well. So these groups were involved in the discussion very early on about the road system, its conditions, and its impact on Iowa's economy. And then, of course, for the broader public input, we had, or the Citizen Advisory Commission hosted 7 public input meetings across the state. Oops. There we go. At the 7 public input meetings, for the meeting format, began with a background presentation, much of which is just what I went through with you very quickly. I guess I'd highlight one thing, I guess, from the Spitfire messaging is that local challenges. Each of the public input meetings, we had a slide or two that highlighted the local transportation issues to bring that message again to the audience. And instead of just having broad statewide funding discussion or needs discussions, we tried to localize it for each of the public input meetings. And then the Citizens Advisory Commission engaged in the input with some specific questions to the audience about how is the system important to you, what do you feel is the condition, is the condition impacting you personally, do you think funding is necessary, and if so, what mechanisms ought to be considered, and then also how do you feel the road fund should be utilized? Should they be utilized for investing in the existing system or more expansion or other modes of transportation? Again, in trying to graphically demonstrate the challenges we face, we shared a couple slides. The one at the top left is obviously a rural timber bridge in Iowa where we had an oversized, overloaded agricultural equipment on the bridge with obviously significant impact to that bridge in that example. You know, we tried to balance between showing the challenges that are being faced but not being too dramatic. We thought this was a good balance in showing the impact of the infrastructure, but also relating it to the agricultural impacts, because we do hear a lot about that, as Beth said. And then a headline from a Des Moines Register series of articles about the challenges that they're facing at the county level and looking at reverting paved roads back to granular roads to lower the maintenance costs. And then a couple slides showing some of the severe weather impacts in Iowa, some flooding impacts, and then also in the top left, severe winter weather impacts with frost boils on some of the granular road system across Iowa. Really well attended meetings. We had over 500 people at those 7 meetings. We also created a website that provided an opportunity for people to provide input, and garnered some input through that effort as well. Real quickly, one thing we're happy about is that we didn't just get only county engineers and city engineers and DOT officials at these meetings. In fact, the majority of the people at these meetings were just citizens, either concerned about the impact on their farming operations to the system, or owners of small businesses or trucking companies. So clearly there are people motivated to come out on a Wednesday night and participate in this discussion, which we were happy about. Just real broadly, the summary, as Beth alluded to, we did hear from the ag community and trucking companies, and I guess particularly on the trucking side, they obviously would be impacted by an increase in the gas tax, but they said the impact they're facing today with higher vehicle operating costs is more than what they'd face if the gas tax was increased. The ag community talked a lot about, they're already being hit now with bridge embargoes and closings, and that's impacting the distances they travel to get their products to market. And then Beth also highlighted the bottom two, which was somewhat of a surprise how much we heard this about from school officials, emergency responders, about the impacts in their ability to provide services to their customers. I won't go through this. We certainly heard that from a strong majority that additional funding is needed. Now again, this contrasts with the broad polling where just the telephone call polling, and there you struggle to get above 50%. But what we find is that as you have the chance to educate the public about certain things, that starts shifting the polling, and clearly the people that attended these meetings understand the impact of the road system and conditions. Strong support amongst participants for increasing fuel tax. Also recognition that fuel tax isn't a long-term sustainable solution. So while short-term actions are necessary, the public recognizes that the state and at the national level, other mechanisms need to be evaluated. And then just some other options raised for funding mechanisms. The this is a good slide, and the Citizens Advisory Commission tried to put together what they felt they heard from the public, and I guess I would link this to Beth's slides. As these are what they heard as are the important values from the audience they heard. One thing that's important, and this is information again that sways that polling. In Iowa, almost all the revenue that comes into the state road use tax fund has constitutional protection, meaning it can only be spent on the roads. It can't be diverted by the legislature for non-roadway purposes, and that's important. The public does have a mistrust of government right now. It's probably higher now than it has been in the past, and if they know that it can't be allocated for other purposes, that moved a lot of support. So one of the recommendations of the Commission is that any new funding must have that protection. Efficiency, I talked about. We hear a lot about you just need to be smarter in how you spend money. We've spent a lot of time over the last decade in addressing that, but there's always more that can be done, more partnerships between state and local jurisdictions to increase efficiency. So the Commission recommended more proactive and transparent efforts to become more efficient. User fee concept with the revenue streams must be preserved. Iowa is a very strong pay-as-you-go state. We do not bond at the state level for transportation, and Iowans feel strongly that should continue. Almost goes without saying that funding mechanisms should be fair and equitable. That links back to the user fee concept as well. And then also, as I closed on the last slide, that you shouldn't wait for the perfect new funding mechanism to be developed. You need to take actions now with the existing revenue streams, but also set the stage for long-term solutions to our funding mechanism challenges. In terms of current status, I guess right after the Citizens Advisory Commission released their report, that was back in November, Governor Branstad moved right away to implement one of their recommendations related to efficiency, and he directed us at the Department of Transportation to begin an effort right away to identify $50 million of efficiency savings in partnership with our local jurisdictions. So we prepared a report and released that in January, identifying some specific actions. A lot of it was related to a more proactive effort in asset management and implementing asset management practices through better selection of preventive maintenance actions, a more aggressive use of preventive maintenance actions in addition to our traditional pavement preservation stewardship activities, partnering with local jurisdictions and implementing asset management at the local level, just expanding our partnerships with local jurisdictions, whether looking at more joint facilities or opportunities to share forces to maintain systems, project cost control on DOT system. So we identified those actions and submitted a report, and a lot of those actions were dependent on our broader Transportation Commission action, and with their program they just will be approving here in the next couple of weeks that implements about $33 million of that efficiency report. From the legislative level, there were several bills implemented to primarily increase the gas tax. They did pass through some subcommittees and committee with pretty strong bipartisan support. Unfortunately, with the gas prices increasing pretty significantly during the legislative session this fall and winter, that really did become a challenge, and it didn't make it through to full votes in the House and Senate. But there is very strong interest in continuing those discussions, and in fact, Governor Branstad in the last week has gone publicly and said he thinks next year is the time to have that discussion. So that was the, as relates to our increasing funding, that's where we're at. The status for the shifting of more funding into the existing system, utilizing a lot of the messaging tools again that we talked about. We've had that discussion with the with our Transportation Commission, the body that approves our program, and they have a draft 5-year program that's out now, and the message that really made an impact on them in this discussion was from the broader asset management discussion and perspective we had. And we obviously were able to get into a lot more detail on that with the commission, but that really resonated with them. And in fact, in the fiscal year 2013, 75% of our program dollars will be going directly into the existing system, and that's a pretty conservative number. A lot of those other dollars are for some interstate modernization in 3 of our metro areas, and you could make a case that a lot of that is improving the existing system as well. But that compares with what I mentioned at the beginning, where back in the 90s, at times we had just 30% of our program dollars going into the existing system. So close with a couple slides about lessons learned, and beginning with what worked. The use of that Citizen Advisory Commission, I think, was extremely helpful and was the only reason we had as much discussion with the legislature this year as we did. I think having that independent body out there driving the public input instead of having DOT bureaucrats up at the stage presenting this information and leading the input was really helpful and important for that public outreach effort. And I think that led to a really successful public outreach. The engagement with stakeholders as part of that process was very successful. I think we got a broad group of stakeholders involved and very supportive. Groups like the Iowa Motor Truck Association, the Bankers Association, Farm Bureau, all were very strong advocates for increasing revenue during the legislative session. I think the messaging effort from Spitfire was really important in understanding the views of the public, the need to invest in the existing system, talk about efficiency, talking about the things that resonate in Iowa, which is the funding is protected and we're continuing our pay-as-you-go initiatives. Also, as Beth mentioned, the consistent messaging is important, and having everybody speaking that message. We worked really hard with our cities and counties to keep them on point about what the message is. And in Iowa, like most states, you know, there's discussions about how much goes to cities, how much goes to counties, how much goes to the DOT, and we had some of that discussion, but I think we were pretty successful in keeping everybody focused on just talking about the need to increase funding for everyone. And also that emphasis on asset management was really helpful, particularly with our commission. And then lastly, in areas that could be improved, while we had a lot of great stakeholder involvement, it was ad hoc and it wasn't very well organized. We saw a lot of separate initiatives going on. For example, the Farm Bureau ran some radio ads towards the end of the session. But we think if the stakeholders were more organized, they could have been a lot more effective in communicating that message. Also, that outreach to the media, we could have done a better job, particularly as Beth mentioned, the use of editorial boards, letters to the editor. That was part of the plan, but for various reasons we didn't follow through or weren't able to follow through with that. We really wanted to use that Citizen Advisory Commission to go out and lead that effort, but that didn't happen. But we think that would have been helpful. And then for the outreach to the broader public, we think there's always room for improvement in that area, perhaps through the use of some of the social media platforms. We've just begun utilizing things like Facebook and Twitter more aggressively now for some other initiatives, and those have been, we think, extremely effective so far in getting the message out to a broader audience. And we always struggle to identify better tools to personalize the infrastructure conditions. We tend to want to talk about pavement smoothness and condition indexes, and those don't really resonate. So that's an area we continue to work with. So with that, I guess, Robbie, we open it to questions?
Yes. Thank you very much. That was great. And I'm just going to see, we have questions here. Oh, good. We do have some questions. And I'll try and take them in the order in which they are being presented. I'm having a little trouble scrolling here.
You can pop it out.
There we go. Hold on just a minute. Okay. And the first question actually is, were there public meetings specifically geared towards issues of funding system preservation? And he says, I think of preservation as taking preventative actions, but so far you've been talking about reconstruction and other improvements. What's your definition of preservation?
Well, all of the 7 public input meetings we had were pretty broad, just as we outlined there, and we didn't get into specific discussion, although I think all of the material we presented really lent itself to talking about investments in the existing system. We did hear we still have some corridors that want to see 4-lane improvement, and we certainly heard from those groups as well, but I think the information we presented was focusing in on investments in the existing system. And, I think preservation, well, you can have lots of definitions of preservation. In Iowa, we tended to focus that on, resurfacing improvements, preventive maintenance types activities. Certainly reconstruction and investing in the existing system is important. And we wouldn't call that an expansion activity for sure, but well, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. Well, we have a couple questions here about whether the slides are going to be available, and we do. We will have this up, the recording and the slides will be up on the SSTI website within 24 hours. Also, there is already a report from Spitfire that is available on the SSTI website. It's under our resources tab. So several people asked about that. And we also had a question, maybe this would be best to Beth. He says, I agree that segmenting the audience is important. Legislators versus contractors is an easy one. But I'm curious, when it comes to segmenting the general public, how do you change your method?
So what's going to be really key here is that you know who your decision maker is. And whether it's, in this case, if it's the General Assembly, are you targeting specific legislators? And then once you determine which legislators you are targeting, you want.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Then you want to think about who in those member districts you're going to want to go after. And again, if you have the benefit of polling, that's where you would look at the crosstabs and be able to see who's really with you. Otherwise, you can look at this from a voter perspective, or you could also look at this, or who are the conduits to those voters? Is it local chambers of commerce? Is it small business associations? Is it, your local PTA? If this is really a public safety issue, do you want to get at this through, parents? So you can look at this from the perspective of how do you want to segment this? Who does your decision maker really care about? Who do they listen to? And who can you get to? So it's going to be important that you're able to do that kind of relationship mapping so that you know who your decision maker cares about, how you can get to them, and then really target that way.
Great, thank you very much. Wow, we have a lot of questions for this. This is, I'm glad people are interested in the topic. So there's a question here. It's often difficult to get the public to focus on policies instead of projects. Was there a lot of project discussion during public meetings? Was this used to redirect the discussion to policy implications?
You know, we certainly heard some discussion about project-specific interests, particularly from those broader corridors that still want to see project completion. But really, I would say the majority of the input was broader and focused on those issues about investing in the existing system for the reasons we talked about, whether it's impacts on vehicle operating costs for the trucking or impacts on the ag community. And I think the meeting format had a little bit to do with that, where the questions that were presented to the public and put on the screen and left up there for the whole input discussion really focused on broader discussion items and didn't say which project need do you have or what's the most important project to be addressed in your area.
Along those lines, too, this is Paul, I just want to chime in. I think having time for a local flavor to come in help offset some of that issue, because potentially you could have, in some instances, a local participant sharing something specific that's going on in that area, and that helped offset some of that issue to really get it focused in towards a broader theme.
And I think that's also where, you know, you've got to have your top-level messages so that you can really pull it back to, if people want to talk about those specific projects, that you can really talk about the overall program and how that all links together.
Thank you. There's also a question here about, I suspect the funds being increased for system preservation are still insufficient to fully address all the maintenance needs. Do you have any issues with people signing on to something that only covers part of the need? In other words, how do you make sure that you do not oversell what you can do?
Well, that's a great question, and you know we talked a lot in the presentation, but more in our reports that we submitted to the legislature, that you know we're focusing in on this critical subset of needs that really are most important. But we go out, we make the statement that if we're successful in getting that funding, the overall system conditions are likely to deteriorate on average. But you know, in Iowa, one of the challenges we face, perhaps more than a lot of other states, is we just have a tremendous amount of infrastructure. We have 114,000 miles of roads in Iowa, with roads on about a per mile grid system. And you know, I think that's really a new reality we're going to be facing in Iowa, is that we're just never going to have enough funding to maintain that much infrastructure in the future. So the DOT cities and counties are going to have to work together in the future to talk about rationalizing that system and focusing on these higher level needs. But you know, I think that is a concern that we face, no matter how much we say that there's going to be some expectation that, okay, we gave you your money, so let's see some results tomorrow, and don't come back and talk about funding challenges for quite some time.
Thank you. We're almost at the end of our hour, but I'm just going to squeeze in a couple more questions. If people have to go, I understand, but we do have a couple more questions here. And one of them is, what impact does the Tea Party have on politics in Iowa related to tax increases? In other words, I guess, you know, was that a factor, and how do you get around that maybe?
It did come out at the end. You know, I'd say during the legislative portion is where you saw some of the Tea Party group coming on, and it was really related towards a broader taxation issue relative to economic times. And there was quite a bit of debate, I think, about that issue specifically. You know, I think in the end where it got us to was one, you know, broadly, you know, I don't want to. You know, I think there's two things to point out. One of the things that we actually did accomplish is from the efficiency side. We actually, in this program, we actually were able to show $33 million of additional programming dollars as the commission moved forward. So that was a big step, I think, towards addressing some of that Tea Party issue that did come out. I don't think it was overly, it didn't like take anything off track. Because one of the last piece I'll just throw out, I'm kind of going along here, is that what I thought was fascinating with the Tea Party group is that they acknowledged the need for transportation funding. The main person that spoke, and I was on the radio at one time with one of the individuals, acknowledged the need for additional funding for transportation. So we thought that in that essence of itself was kind of a win in the perspective. Now it got caught into this broader taxation issue relative to the economic uncertainty.
Well, thank you. It's an interesting perspective because I know that's an issue for a lot of people. And I'm just going to ask one final question to clarify. When you were talking about feedback, you said that you got a lot of feedback that the funding should be reserved, and Stu had said for roads, but I'm just clarifying whether people actually said they felt it should be spent on roads or on transportation. Because I know there's some sensitivity in some states about it being used for something outside transportation, but do you have flexibility to use it for other types of transportation besides roads, and is that a really strong feeling among the people that you heard from?
By how we set this up, we really focused the discussion on the road and bridge system in Iowa. For a couple of reasons. One, that was the mandate from the study we were working on, and that was also the mandate from the governor to talk about that system. So our public input, we really wanted to focus the discussion on roads and bridges. We've done other studies looking at other modes of transportation and the needs as well. And part of the reason for that too as well is this constitutional protection of almost all the money we get for the road use tax fund is that it has to be spent on roads.
Okay.
And we heard a lot of support from that from the public. But we did also hear from folks that while they understand there's increased needs, that we need to also make sure we're investing in the other modes and have a good multimodal transportation system that provides access and options to all islands.
Well, thank you very much. And we did go a little bit over time. We will have the recording up within 24 hours. And there is a report also on the SSTI website from Spitfire. And I want to thank all of the participants and everybody who logged on and everybody who asked questions. Thanks very much. It was a great webinar.